A dramatic departure announced in Westminster today, Chris.
A party leader stands aside.
Another one?
I know. This time it is the leader of the Scottish National Party at Westminster, Ian Blackford, who has been on Newscast in the past and is going to stand down, and so will be no more as the leader of the Westminster group of SNP MPs, as the third party, who you hear from every week at Prime Minister's Questions, and so it's quite a sort of big noise around these parts. It looks like a guy called Stephen Flynn will be the successor.
And the outgoing Ian Blackford was incoming on Newscast in May when we interviewed him from his croft, because he's a farmer. And the SNP at Westminster isn't the only flock he looks after. He has a flock of sheep, and he revealed some of his favourites to us when we chatted to him last time.
This year's two have been called Mango and Chutney, and I'm trying to negotiate that they're sold on as tups elsewhere, because you can't keep keeping pets, but there is an attachment that you have to them, and they'll actually come to the door and bang their noses on the door to be allowed in to be fed.
Now, I found myself wondering what happened to Mango and Chutney, because
You felt like you wanted a life status update.
Because there's a few options for what could have happened to them, let's be honest.
Yes, there's different journeys upon which they could go. Anyway, we've sought comment, haven't we, from Mango and Chutney?
Yeah, Ian Blackford got in touch with us just as we started recording this episode of Newscast. He says Mango and Chutney are both well. They're on our croft and are growing. So they've not been for the chop.
Not yet, at least.
Right, let's tuck into this episode of Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Adam in the studio.
And Chris in the studio.
And Chris, in typical fashion, you and I both take a day off this podcast, and Wednesday's episode available on BBC Sounds. David Cameron popped up.
Yeah, we get a former Prime Minister. I mean, there's a few of them about these days, but nonetheless...
True, yeah, less exciting than say, 10 years ago.
But nonetheless, getting a former Prime Minister on our podcast is always a good thing, isn't it? You know, to be able to kick around what they're up to. And so, yeah, David Cameron was on yesterday talking about all things dementia and Alzheimer's, which is something that he sort of picked up and run with as an issue, as a theme, as something that, of course, is massively important to millions and millions of families ever since he's been Prime Minister. So he was talking about this big breakthrough, wasn't he, that was in the news yesterday.
Yeah, but it's okay because we've got some great guests for us to talk to. We've got Victoria Atkins, who is a Treasury Minister, and Stephen Kinnock, who's the Shadow Immigration Minister. Hello.
Hello.
Now, Stephen, I mean, this is probably a tricky thing for you to discuss live on a programme, but dementia is something that your family is going through at the moment because of your mum. How's she doing?
Well, she's just not really Glenys Kinnock anymore. It's an awful illness because you find yourself grieving for somebody who's standing right there in front of you. And she's still very lovely and charming, but also there's no real sense in anything she says. So it's very, very difficult to engage with her at all now, really. So, yeah, it's very sad and it's an awful thing. But I'm so encouraged by the discovery of this drug because I think for the first time they're addressing the causes of Alzheimer's rather than just the symptoms and clearing this kind of rogue protein out. So I really, really want to see this coming to market as quickly as possible and being used by the thousands and thousands of families who are suffering from this awful thing.
Because the really striking thing is that this is a issue, isn't it? This is a disease that is becoming more and more prominent in an ageing society with these attempts to grapple to find solutions and the right drugs, and so many families in exactly the situation you're in.
That's right. I mean, it's a great thing that we live in a society where people can get older and live very, very long lives. But there are clearly some issues that arise from that. But the thing is with my mum, I mean, she's in her late 70s now, but it's really been there for 8-9 years. I mean, she was diagnosed with it 5 years ago, and the last couple of years she's really deteriorated. So it's the early onset Alzheimer's, which I think is really, really hard for people. And also, you know, when your parents, they make plans about how they want to live that part of their lives, and it all just gets taken away from them. So, it's a growing issue, and of course, developing these drugs is very expensive. But if you think about the savings that we can make in terms of helping people with dealing with this, in society more broadly, it's absolutely an investment in order to save. And I have so much respect and admiration for these scientists who are doing this research and coming up with these wonder drugs. It's just absolutely extraordinary what science can achieve.
There was a bit in James Cook's interview on Newscast with David Cameron where David Cameron says, "Oh, former prime ministers shouldn't comment too much because then they're like backseat drivers." And then he commented, and he talked about the cap on social care of £86,000 that was supposed to be coming in next year, but in the autumn statement, the Chancellor pushed it back a couple of years. And David Cameron was quite critical, of that policy, because he says that helps better off people keep more of their assets compared to less well-off people. And he was also critical of the delay to the policy. What would you say to DC?
Well, with the policy itself, we have had to listen to local authorities who obviously will be responsible for delivering much of the deal not reforms, and they didn't.
He was the guy that proposed the cap in the first place.
And they told us they weren't in the position yet of being able to roll it out well, because obviously when we do something, we want it to be delivered as well as possible for the people on the receiving end of the help, which is why we've delayed it for a couple of years. But nonetheless, in the meantime, Jeremy announced an enormous investment of £8 billion, both in the NHS and in social care, because of course, we're seeing already in the NHS some of the problems that having that, if you like, that sticky spot, the glue of releasing people from hospital is having, not just for those individual patients that want to get to the next stage after hospital, move back into their homes or into a care home, and that's having a massive impact on the NHS as a whole.
Let's talk about another topic that's been in the news this week, and it's the issue of private schools. And Labour, Stephen, your party's policy around charging VAT on private school fees. And it's intrigued me, this kind of issue has been kicked around at various points over the last 10, 15, 20 years, but what intrigued me about this week is that the Daily Mail, which has the lightest splash of scepticism about Labour quite often, for 2 days in a row had this story on its front page. And then, intriguingly, Keir Starmer decided to lean into it and do it as his main or opening set of questions at Prime Minister's Questions, when he might have chosen to stick to the policy, but not kind of put it up in lights. And what fascinates me about this is this dividing line, because at Prime Minister's Questions, Keir Starmer made his argument with passion, and Rishi Sunak made his argument around aspiration versus, if you like, Keir Starmer's arguments around quote-unquote fairness, and both sides leaning into passionately defending their own side of that argument. And I wonder, Stephen, if you think that idea is a vote winner, because the argument that can come back is one around, defending aspiration, defending the right of parents to choose, and ensuring that those who might scrimp and save to pay for school fees aren't frozen out of making that choice.
Well, whether or not it's a vote winner, it's absolutely the right thing to do, because there's a key point of principle here, which is, should working people across the country be subsidising the top 7% who are able to afford to send their children to private schools? And I think the answer to that question is no. It's simply not right. I mean, Keir, in Prime Minister's Questions, used the example of Winchester School, which had, a theatre and a shooting range and all sorts of other things, and had been given a subsidy, effectively, of £6 million of taxpayers' money, where we've got schools across the country that are really struggling to get the resources that they need. So I think there's a fundamental point of principle here. Politics is about choices.
So you accept it might not be popular, it might cost you votes?
No, I think you've got to do what's right. I think there's very often a strong overlap between what's right and what's popular.
Even if the net consequence of that were to be that the kind of super rich, if you like, can still pay it because an extra 20% won't really touch the sides for them. But for those for whom it is a massive outlay with huge sacrifice, they'll be the ones who can no longer afford it.
I think there's probably a growing number of people across the country who can't afford it anymore because of the cost of living crisis, which is eating into the middle class as well.
So in which case it won't generate much money then?
Well, I think it will generate about £1.3 billion is the number I've seen, which is a significant amount of money with which you can resource state schools, get in more teachers, give them the facilities they need. I don't think they're going to all get a shooting range like they have at Winchester School, but nevertheless, I think that money will be very useful in terms of boosting investment. And this argument about aspiration, I think it's more really about the Conservative Party standing up for vested interests rather than aspiration. They stand up for the oil and gas companies, they're standing up for the non-DOMs, and they're standing up for the private schools. So I think Keir Starmer's putting a very clear choice in front of the British people. Do you want a party that stands up for working people and aspiration for working people, or do you want a party that stands up for vested interests?
Victoria, take on the argument as you hear it.
Well, just before I deal with the policy, what is interesting and what's emerging, I think, about Labour's strategy is that they don't seem terribly comfortable talking about policy unless they couple it with personal attacks on Rishi. So the attack on private schools, independent schools and VAT policy wasn't done in the round. It was done as an attack on Rishi for the choice that his parents made about his schooling when, by the way, he will have been 11 years old, so I don't know how many children have a choice at that age. But they attack him on his schooling. They also then veer into attacks on the achievements and the success he has had in his career. And again, in this country, we tend, I hope, to celebrate people working hard, making a success of their lives in the many, many different ways that can be achieved. And then they move on to an attack about who he fell in love with and the fact that he married her and
You
what
must
her
be
background
really upset
is.
when Rishi Sunak accuses Keir Starmer of being a North London lawyer then.
Well, I
'Cause
mean,
that's that.
I mean, as a lawyer myself, a bit a barrister, there is a difference between.
Yes.
I'm always very proud when people refer to my legal career.
On the private schools thing, I'll push back to Stephen in a second about the merits or otherwise of personalising an argument rather than setting it in the broader round. But on the critique that Stephen makes of what he perceives to be the unfairness of the current model in terms of the tax breaks that private schools are given, you say what?
Well, we stand for freedom of choice. So, if people...
But you could do that by charging VAT on school fees, couldn't you?
And we want people to be able to make choices for their children. And the figures, again, Labour have created these figures, but there will be a knock-on effect, of course, as you've already identified, that if people move their children out of that sector, of course it's going to have an impact on the state sector, which, by the way, is doing really, really well. We've risen 9 places in the international league tables in terms of our accomplishments in English and maths. We have more good and outstanding schools than ever. So there is an enormous amount of success and achievement and creativity within our comprehensive system. But we know that we want to support that even more, which is why in the autumn statement we were able to commit £4 billion more funding for our schools, precisely because we want to help children in the future.
And Stephen, on that personalisation thing, are you comfortable with that as an approach when making a political argument like this or any other? You can have an argument, can't you, about the funding of education, state and private and all of that. But for Keir Starmer to go for the personal stuff, the school that the Prime Minister was at, is that reasonable? Is that the way political discourse should rightly be conducted?
Well, as you have already pointed out, the Conservatives have a very long record of making very bitter personal attacks on Labour leaders.
I'm not seeking to ask you in this necessarily in this, just in the round. Does that aid our political discussion, or does it trivialise it or demean it? If we look at issues through the prism of the personal individual that we're talking about, as opposed to looking at it as a policy theme,
I think that it can help to throw into sharp relief the choices that people make as political leaders,
so it's fair
and
going.
that it reflects a political ideology, because actions speak louder than words. So if you've taken certain choices and those choices have clear political implications, then I think it's absolutely fair to point out, look, you say this, but you did this, that's hypocritical, or you say this, you did this, that reflects the kind of person you are. So when people go to the ballot box at the next general election, it's right that they know what it is they're voting for.
But you don't choose who you fall in love with, do
No,
you?
but
They can choose what tax to pay.
Yeah. And look.
And she made 2 choices.
And
one was
she
originally
has
to be a
now,
non-dom, and then the other one.
now paying, everything and more than she does. But it's just that
I'm talking about the Bouncer's wife here, which should be clear. Yeah.
But
I just don't think that argument stacks up because, of course,
Well,
you
you
don't
don't
choose who you fall in love with. But this is a
isn't a
political
romance
decision
podcast.
about
I mean, I'm
revenue
sure
for
you
the
could offer
exchequer.
great advice
I mean,
to people who've got dilemmas.
It's
but,
absurd.
Right, now, I've just noticed you two, actually, but you two do have something in common, which is you're both from political dynasties, sort of. There's the Kinnocks, and your dad was an MP.
Yeah.
But let's talk about a proper dynasty now, the Windsors. Are you going to watch this new Harry and Meghan documentary on Netflix? Because the trailer for it dropped just before we started recording this programme.
Wow, I don't know. I do watch The Crown.
Yeah.
I do quite enjoy
Where were
The
you
Crown.
up
I
to?
think
Are
it's
you bang up to date?
I know. I think I've watched 2 episodes of this latest series,
Okay.
but
I'm
I have
s-
watched
I'm
it.
still
I
at
think
the
it's quite
coronation.
fascinating.
I'm
Have you watched it?
I'm still at the coronation.
No, you don't.
I'm
That was when it was good. Controversial.
I'm miles behind.
Will you watch?
Chris,
will you watch
always
that
behind the
documentary?
curve. Always
wa-
behind the curve.
I
Are you watching it in colour? You've got a colour TV.
I don't know. I mean, I just about managed to watch Matt Hancock in the final of I'm a Celebrity, so
and what did you
I haven't
do?
got much time to watch telly at the moment.
He's back, isn't he?
Well, apparently so. He's back tomorrow
Yeah.
Will you be pleased to see him back?
with his POV. Look, I mean, he's eaten things that I could never in a million years eat. So hats off him for doing those trials.
Should he be
but,
back in the Conservative fold at some point?
that is a matter for the Chief Whip and the Prime Minister.
I know, but I thought I'd ask you anyway.
He should not have been away, but
Is there something in his argument though
He
that
ate
says
some appalling things.
if politicians are going to communicate beyond those who are super interested, then finding your way onto TV shows with colossal audiences where you're seen in the round, 3-dimensional, and all the rest of
or
it is quite.
podcasts.
Well, there is that. We like
We
to
don't
make
have quite as many viewers.
we like to make our little contribution, but
Actually,
is there
there's something we've got for you to... No, I'm just kidding.
got you a little snap. Yeah.
I was wondering what those maggots over there were for. Yeah.
But I mean, is there something in his argument? I know his critics will say it's a self-serving argument, all the rest of it, and he's clearly made a lot of money from going in and all that. But that argument that says that for politicians and political argument to cut through, going into the places where there are big audiences, where people are seen in the round, everyone's 3-dimensional, but sometimes the prisms of Westminster can crush people down to a caricature, is kind of worth doing, actually.
I think it's really interesting. When was it Barack Obama said that? I mean, his campaign started by going to people's living rooms and 10 people turning up and them spreading the word. So I guess when we're knocking on doorsteps, canvassing, that's what we're trying to do, albeit in a very, very tiny sense in compared to.
I mean, and of course you had things like Ed Balls who just did so well on Strictly and
goodness,
became a bit of a
amazing.
national treasure as a result of that. But I think there's a huge difference between doing that and doing something whilst Parliament is sitting. And I'm sorry to be like the Grinch here, but I just think it's wrong. I think it brings Parliament into disrepute because you fundamentally are elected to legislate, to be in Parliament, participate in debates, vote in laws. It's the greatest honour and privilege of my life to be the MP for Aberavon, and I just think it's an insult to your electors, to your constituents, to do what he did. So yeah, I think it's completely out of order.
And on the political dynasty thing, I'm slightly overstating it there, but as the children of MPs, we hear, don't we, so often people saying, oh, not enough people are drawn towards politics anymore, it can be a tough job, you're on a 5-year contract with the electorate, living in 2 places, all that sort of stuff. I suppose a newscaster might wonder, I mean, what's interesting is neither of you were put off by the political life, by growing up surrounded by it, when, it does have its strains and its difficulties, and being in public life and being on the side of arguments where, it might be unpopular or whatever, and yet you still decided to go for it, which I just think is kind of quite intriguing. You saw enough to lure you in rather than put you off.
Yeah, and actually, similarly, my mum is very politically active as well. She's a councillor in her local area. And so for me, they both showed me, actually, that politics can be a real force for good. And so I'm sort of, I hope I'm showing that to my son.
I hadn't really thought I would do it. I tell you what actually really tipped me into doing it was my time in Russia. So I was director of the British Council in St. Petersburg from 2005 to 2008, and we got embroiled in it was just the relationship between the UK and Russia had gone into the deep freeze, and the British Council became a political football in all of that, and just being up close and personal with a regime that is just utterly ruthless, where there is no accountability, no sense that if the authorities come for you, you've got nowhere to hide. It just made me realise how much we take our democracy for granted here. And that was when I decided I would go for it. Yeah.
Could you see what has happened since coming? in terms of what's happened in Russia and Putin and the nature of where Russia finds itself now?
I came to the conclusion in Russia that we'd been profoundly naive and complacent about regimes like the Russian and the Chinese and others. And from that moment, it was a kind of wake-up call that the West had got far too comfortable, and, you know, the end of history, and it was all going to be this relentless march towards liberal democracy. When you're out in Russia and you're up close and personal with those people, you realise how just deeply wrong and naive that analysis was. And I think we are now seeing some of those chickens coming home to roost.
Victoria and Stephen, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Well, now we're going to talk about the cost of living and various other issues because we're joined by rapper, campaigner, documentary maker, Professor Green. Hello.
Hello.
Welcome.
Thank you.
I thought when I was telling Chris that you were coming on, I'd have to explain who you were because...
Little did you know.
Little did I know you two have got history. Tell us how far back you go.
So about 3 a.m. in Stoke, which sounds quite
A night
ominous.
out? Exactly. What club was it?
So this was a town hall, town hall, incredibly bright lights, 3 o'clock in the morning, Friday morning, Thursday into Friday, by-election for Stoke-on-Trent Central. I just reminded myself of this.
2017.
In 2017, yeah. And you were making a documentary at the time, I think.
I was, yeah. It was Working Class White Men for Channel 4, which was a two-parter, which would have come out, I think, 2018, I think. We got some really good stuff. I mean, we did, obviously, because we got the documentary. Otherwise, if it weren't any good, they'd have told us to sign off.
And in the old days, Chris Mason was famous for staying up all night on BBC One on a Thursday night until there was a result of the by-election.
I want to bring you to the sort of here and now and the work you've been doing with the big issue. And really striking statistic about the increase just in the last few months in the number of vendors going out and selling the big issue as a kind of metric of just how much so many people are struggling at the moment.
Yeah, I think really unprecedented times. And the fact that we have people who have never encountered perhaps financial stress or debt or worry around their finances before encountering it for the first time. Had this conversation a few times, and, you know, growing up how I did and where I did, my family, my nan, had dealt with difficulties around money for a long time, and as had everyone.
Where did you grow up?
In Upper Clapton, Hackney. A lot of times when I say Clapton, people go Clacton. I'm like, no.
Another famous by-election.
Equally quite as bad, but no sea to swim in. But yeah, it was tough for everyone on the estate I grew up in, and everyone become quite thick-skinned and quite resilient because of that. You know, and resilience is a word that goes missing when we talk about mental health and, you know, people opening up and being more sensitive, men especially. Resilience goes missing, but actually what you get when you've suffered with that for your entire life is a bunch of really quite resilient people who are used to this. Doesn't make it easy, but they understand it and know how to navigate it without burying their head in the sand. Scary thing is, I think, when you have people that are walking into this situation for the first time who have never encountered this stress or had to worry about putting food on the table, that's scary for a lot of people. And encountering that for the first time in your 30s or 40s, that's recipe for disaster. You know, that's the makings of wanting to bury your head in the sand and perhaps doing that and therefore not staying on top of things, let alone getting ahead of.
Resilience goes missing. What an interesting phrase. What do you mean?
The idea of resilience goes missing. So I kind of I apologise because I segue quite a lot.
No, it's fine.
That's
I'm
the bouncing
fascinated
ball
by
in
that.
my brain.
Yeah, I'm
But
fascinated by that.
So the reason we're probably talking to each other now and spoke to each other in Stoke is because I've done a hell of a lot of work around men's mental health in particular and opening the floor to that conversation. I was probably the least likely candidate in 2012-13 to do that, but here we are. And I get annoyed listening to a lot of conversations around mental health because it's, you know, men are encouraged to be more sensitive and more open. That's necessary, but don't forget, men or women, we are all blimmin' resilient. And without that resilience, you won't get through anything. And if you're open and sensitive and you tell everyone your every problem, I guarantee you someone will take advantage of that. So you shouldn't just be walking around telling everyone your woes.
Right.
You know, you have to be careful in how you approach dealing with your sensitivities and your vulnerabilities and your issues. Some days you have to get out of the house and put the mask on. I don't think people should bottle things up. Not forever and permanently and not have someone to talk to. But in some instances, your friends are the worst people because they've all lived a life and they might not feel like they have any ulterior motives, but their lives are going to influence their advice. There are people, professionals, who have studied for years and years to give you good advice. Seek those people out and share your woes with them, because they have no ulterior motives and are not bringing their personal life into that room.
Yeah.
Whereas your silly mate, who barely even has an education, what
Don't
kind of
let
advice
peer
are you...
pressure, yeah.
And also, if someone, you go up to your mate, you build yourself up and you go, mate, I'm suffering with anxiety. Anxiety? What are you? Do you know what I mean? Like, just because they've not suffered anxiety, you can't expect everyone to be able to help you with your issues.
Your, I hesitate to say professional journey, because we always use that word journey, and it's a bit of a sort of cliche. But
It's been a very bumpy road.
well, yeah, but you've when I first met you 5 years ago, and you're doing that documentary, you'd been doing documentary work and alongside your other stuff. Now you're doing more and more, aren't you, of the social campaigning stuff? There's
Yeah.
been that sort of, if you like, has there been a sort of reorientation that perhaps has taken you by surprise in terms of where you've gone?
I think
or?
largely when they look to the it's probably just because there's not that many working class voices,
Right,
to be honest.
right.
If you weren't to have me sitting here talking to you about this, who would you have?
You were a big supporter of Jeremy Corbyn.
I
Or maybe
liked him.
big is not the right word, but
Yeah,
you supported. You were enthused by Jeremy Corbyn.
I was, yeah, and it helped meeting him. Come across as a very kind person and an empathetic person, someone who actually had feelings and understood the plight, of people, of the working class especially. I mean, I felt it was hard for him, wasn't it? Really difficult.
Some people would argue he made it even harder for himself.
Potentially, yeah, but again, humans, we don't get everything right, do we? And sometimes you lose self-awareness when you're in such a position, I think.
Could you find yourself getting enthused about Keir Starmer?
Do you know what? I'll be honest, I as much as I disagree with apathy, and I think it's really important to take an interest, because for most of my life I didn't, because I just felt politics, they don't talk like me, they don't sound, it's nothing to do with me. Politics is not for me, I'm not from the place, where, it just doesn't apply to me. Then you realise it absolutely applies to you, because the decisions they make impact your life and have impacted your life already. But I find it tough at the moment. And I think after COVID as well, I was in Morocco for 3.5 months during the first lockdown, which sounds lovely, but we were stuck in the apartment. It was state of emergency. You weren't allowed to use anything. You couldn't go to the beach. And we had electrical storms and bad weather for 8.5 weeks. So even the balcony wasn't that much fun a place to be.
What were you doing there?
Visiting my partner's family. But what happened was, in that 3.5 months, was the news was on constantly, and it was just a barrage of really horrible numbers of cases of deaths without any context, and it really depressed me. There was many contributing factors to that, and I don't use the word depressed lightly, but it really started to plague me, and so I just stopped watching it. And I read enough news now to keep up to date with what's going on, but not enough to bring my mood down.
Fair enough. Now for something completely different. As an audio professional, I've always been intrigued by Chris's headphones technique.
Really?
Yeah, he has one headphone on and the other one sort of half on.
Well, not even half. I have one fully on and one not on at all, really.
Yeah,
so
but it's sort of squishing your ear, though.
I get that, though. That gives me a sense of being in the room and present, but also still being able to hear what I sound like through the mic.
Just listen to this, Adam.
It works for me.
Well,
but
I don't believe it when he says it. He's said that to me for many years, but I believe it when he says it.
When I record, especially if I have to pitch, I'm really bad at singing.
Me too.
really bad at singing. That's why I get so many other people to sing on my songs, because the stuff I write sounds much better when they sing it. But yeah, this just gives me an idea of what I actually sound like. I get the best of both worlds, or the worst in some instances.
There you go, you see. This is what I've been telling you for years.
What does it say about me that I like to hear myself twice in both ears at all times? Brilliant. Well, thanks very much. Lovely to meet you.
Lovely to meet you.
Cheers.
See you. Bye.
Well, that's the view of one professor. On the next episode of Newscast on BBC Sounds, I'll be speaking to another one, Professor Simon Sharma.
Oh.
He's got a new show available on iPlayer.
Am I allowed to say that you thought, when you were told we had Professor Green on, that you thought it was Professor Green of Oxford University?
It's Manchester.
Oh, is it?
Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.